All right, so I want to continue on today talking about asymptotic methods for neural field models. And in particular, today we're going to cover something that hasn't come up at all this semester, which is the effect of noise on solutions. So I want to just show a movie real quick, and then the lecture will be aimed at understanding what's happening in this movie. Okay, so if you remember, on Monday and Wednesday we talked about neural field models. This profile here, this is one of those bump solutions that we derived on Monday and Wednesday. This emerges through an instability that forms a pattern forming instability. And so this is your variable u as a function of x. And if there were no perturbations to the system, remember, this is a stable bump, although it's, I guess I should say it's marginally stable, so that the bump can prefer to be at any position, right? So you could shift this bump to the right, you could shift it to the left, and it would not relax back to this particular location, okay? So you have translation symmetry of the integral differential equation, and that means your solutions are also translation symmetric. And anytime you have translation symmetry in a PDE or integral PDE, you're going to have a zero eigenvalue associated with the linearization around those solutions, okay? Just like, if you remember from ODEs, when you have line attractor solutions, you have a zero eigenvalue, and that means you have fixed points basically that live along a line. So if you perturb along that line, you will not relax back. So what I'm going to do in this movie is I'm going to add noise. And for the purposes today, if you don't know much about stochastic processes, just think of this as going into your forward Euler method and adding a normally distributed random variable at every spatial grid point here, okay, along the bump, okay. And what that's going to do is it's going to perturb the position of the bump. And where is most of the movement of this bump going to happen? Okay, it's not going to be that the bump gets really big or gets really small. It's that it's going to be moved along its marginally stable direction, which is to either be shifted to the right or left. But because it's noise, that movement is going to look like diffusion. The bump's going to perform a random walk. Okay, so I'll go ahead and start the movie, and you can see that yes, the profile of the bump is getting perturbed. Okay, but the main thing represented by this vertical red line is that the bump is wandering around. Let me show it one more time. Okay, so the bump wanders around like that. Okay, so what we'd like to do is estimate the amplitude of that diffusion as it depends on the form of the bump and also how much noise we're injecting into the system and maybe some properties of that noise, although I won't dwell on that too much. Since I don't want to visit with stochastic processes too much. Okay, so we've already sort of introduced this, but we're talking about models of the human brain, and the brain is made up of 10 to the 11 neurons. Actually, the average number of connections between neurons depends on how you take that average. The median number is actually 4 connections because most of the neurons in your brain are what are called cerebellar granule cells, okay? But the cortex, which is the new part of the brain that sort of, is the outer part of your brain that mammals evolved, that each of those neurons has a lot more synapses that connects them. So each neuron in a cortical network, okay, which is like the areas that process vision, sound, some smell, also is responsible for more sophisticated sort of cognitive functions like short-term memory. Those networks tend to be comprised of neurons that are connected by a lot of synapses. So each neuron gets a lot of inputs from its neighbors, okay? And we already said the main way that neurons communicate is via chemical signaling between them. That's the result of activity within each individual neuron, which is spikes. And if you stuck an electrode into one of these neurons, essentially you would find that the membrane potential, the electrical potential across the membrane of the cell would, there's some period where it's quiet and then it spikes. And the neural field models essentially that we're writing down, they average over all these spikes, and they say on average in sort of short time intervals, how many neurons in this little pocket of this network are spiking right now. Okay. And when spikes sort of travel down, the axons, which is sort of one of these long sort of filamentous structures coming off the main sort of round shaped somas, it sends these chemical signals across, and that's what's responsible for these synaptic connections that we've modeled. Okay. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what's called working memory. Okay, it's basically the process by which you store like little pieces of information, like a 7-digit phone number, for a few seconds, and then use it to do something. And you use it when you're reading, use it when you're driving in order to remember, where the cars are around you, and maybe what turn is coming up. When you're talking, when you're playing sports, when you're writing. Okay, and lots of mammals also use this for navigation. So essentially to remember where it is that they currently are right now. You have systems in your brain that actually integrate your movement, your velocity, in order to help you remember where you're going. Okay, so even if you didn't have a map, if you walked around your neighborhood with your eyes closed, if you could actually do that, you would have some vague sense of where you're going, because you can basically integrate your velocity. You know about how fast you're going. You take the integral of that, and then that gives you your current position. Okay, so working memory is limited. Okay, and it's limited in a couple of ways. You can only sort of store a few items at once, right? So you can't store like 100-digit phone number in your brain, but you can store about 10 digits. But once you get up to sort of international phone numbers, it gets a little bit harder, and it degrades with the number of items that you store. Also, working memory is limited by time. Okay, so the longer you go, it's harder and harder to sort of remember something that was supposed to be stored in working memory. And then, of course, there's a lot of ambiguity with working memory, which is supposed to operate on the time scale of seconds to minutes, versus long-term memory, which operates on hours, days, months, years. Okay, and so I don't want to get too much into that, but the idea is that there is a system where you store stuff for a short period of time and then basically delete it. And that's sort of time limited to a few seconds or a minute. Okay. So we're going to talk about how bumps are a good model of working memory if you're trying to remember something like the location of an object. Okay. And there's some background papers that I can put in Canvas on this. And then we're going to talk about what happens when you add noise to this bump. And we'll probably basically only get to this diffusive wandering part, which was the movie I showed at the beginning. But if miraculously I go faster than I usually do, then I might get to other sort of interesting nonlinear dynamical properties that occur if we take our weight function and change it from being just a distance dependent one. Okay, and I can post some background on that. There's a lot of other directions for this that you could go, but we only have a day for this, so I probably won't get to that. Okay. And so the main sort of experiment or task or sort of storage mechanism that we're going to talk about is the idea of storing the location of an object on a screen. Okay, and to make things simple, we'll say this object can only be located along some circle, okay, that sort of is the size of the diameter of this square, okay, screen that it's in. And monkeys can do this, and you can record from their brains while they're doing this. Basically, you show them an object, the screen goes blank, they wait a few seconds, and then they're asked to tell you where they think that object was. And they do it by moving their eyes. It's called a saccade. And if you look at a monkey doing this task like a whole bunch of times, like tens of thousands of times, then what you find is that on average, the saccade movement is normally distributed around the true location of the remembered object. So that suggests that this short-term memory process is, obeys some sort of diffusion, like, Brownian motion or a random walk. Okay, just like a heat equation would. And we've already written down this model, but just to motivate it a little bit, the idea is that if you record from the brains of these monkeys during this delay period, what you find is that there's specific neurons that are more active during the delay period and other neurons that are sort of quieter. And so the gray bar here is where this cue is on. And then the delay period is where it's off, where it's when they're supposed to be remembering things. And it seems like this neuron here is active because it's storing information about the remembered object. Okay, and these other neurons are not active, but it turns out if you had presented the object here, then like this neuron would be active because it likes objects that occur at 270 degrees. And there's different areas of the brain that have these sorts of neurons. And what you find is that neurons that have sort of similar cue location preferences tend to be strongly coupled together by excitation, which means that they sort of activate each other. And neurons that don't like similar locations are not very strongly connected. And that also within this network, there's a global inhibitory signal. So all these activating neurons connect to these inactivating neurons, these inhibitory neurons, and those feed back on all the other neurons and provide this sort of blanket of inactivation. So the net effect is that this neuron, through sort of a chain of two connections, will do something like inhibit this neuron over here. Okay, and that's the idea of those sort of cosine shaped connectivity functions. Okay, so you present an object, and the idea is that if you looked at all these neurons, you would see this kind of activity in the network. Okay, and the location of this bump of activity is remembering the location of this cue, so that if it moves a little bit over here, then you're essentially your error is given by the difference between this red triangle here and the black triangle here. Okay, so that's what we want to model, and we'll see how the math works out with the neural field equations. I already wrote down a model almost exactly like this, except now we're going to go between minus pi and pi, right? Because we're going to go from basically 0 around to 360. I'll convert that to radians, and I'll just to have nice symmetry, I'll say I'll go from minus pi to pi here. And again, for simplicity, I'm going to take this weight function to just be a function of the difference between each neuron's sort of cue location preference. We have this nonlinearity again, and we have this input, spatiotemporal input. Okay, so this is all stuff I said on Monday and Wednesday. This is your nonlinearity. We're going to take the limit of a really steep nonlinearity. So you definitely have bump solutions in that case. Okay, and essentially f is going to be a Heaviside function. And so the only parameter left of it is basically where this threshold is. And our wave function is going to look like this. It's basically just going to be a cosine function. Okay, so you're going to have local excitation and long range inhibition. Okay, and then this external input represents the cue, although we're not too worried about basically what effect this has, other than that it produces a bump for us. Okay, and so when the input is off, okay, and there's no input in the system, we can actually solve for these bump solutions. And I wrote down this equation the other day. We're actually going to solve it today. We can do that because we have a step nonlinearity. The idea is that if you present a cue that's peaked at some location, so that would mean like this function I is going to be some kind of Gaussian peaked function. And the time component of it is only going to make it on for some period of time, and then it's going to be 0 here. You produce a bump of activity when you do this. So this is a space-time plot of the bump, and the network sort of encodes the peak location of this indefinitely. So you can see immediately how this network can encode remembered locations. And it turns out you could have presented that input over here, and you would have produced a bump there, and it would just stay there indefinitely, right? Now, this is with no noise in this model, and you have perfect memory, right? But of course, the brain is full of fluctuations and heterogeneity and all sorts of things that are going to, not give you this nice sort of smooth, unendingly stationary profile of the bump. Okay. Just real quick, I'll show you how to derive these bump solutions. The idea is to sort of build them self-consistently. So you assume that there's a stationary bump solution like this, okay? And when W is just a cosine function, so that function that I wrote down on the modeling slide, and U is, let's assume that it's also cosine shaped, because that's basically all the modes you can get out of this integral. You can work out the amplitude of the bump is given by this implicit equation, okay? Now, if we take a Heaviside firing rate function with a threshold theta, that means inputs below theta lead to no activity, inputs above theta lead to sort of maximal activity. This bump is going to have 2 points where it's going to cross threshold, right? As long as its activity is above 0. It's going to have this point where the bump sort of rises above, and then this other point where it falls back below. And we're going to say that this half width here is A, little a. And so if we plug that into our equation here, we get a much cleaner formula for what big A should be. It's just going to be 2 times sine of little a, the half width of the bump, okay? And if we then say, well, I know that the bump needs to cross below and above threshold at theta, then we have this implicit equation for the value of the bump solution at plus and minus a. It needs to equal theta. I can plug that into just the formula that I now have for my bump, and it's just going to be this, and we can actually solve this now for little a. And it turns out it has 2 solutions, okay? One of them is a fat, sort of tall bump, and the other is a sort of small, I guess not exactly narrow bump, but it's a shorter bump, and it's unstable. So if we do kind of a linear stability analysis like we did the other day for our homogeneous solution, we find that this is stable and this is an unstable bump. Okay, the wide bump is stable, the narrow bump is unstable. And this is true not just for this specific choice of parameters I made. This is true kind of across a wide range of instantiations of this model. Okay. And so if you're familiar with some, it's kind of nonlinear dynamics and bifurcation diagrams, essentially we can, as we vary theta, our bifurcation parameter, what we find is that eventually you raise the threshold enough that the stable and the unstable bump annihilate each other in a saddle node bifurcation. And beyond this, there's no bumps at all. Okay. And if you look at the dynamics really close to this, if any of you have ever read that the nonlinear dynamics book by Strogatz, you have what are called these ghosts. So you can still get bumps that sort of last a long period of time, but they sort of slowly die. But they look a lot like bumps, and that's because they're reminiscent of basically what occurs at the stable branch here. Okay. All right. So I don't know if I want to go ahead and do the local stability analysis. So maybe I'll walk through the local stability analysis, because this is actually some kind of perturbation theory, and it helps us understand what's going to happen a little bit later. So if I want to determine that stability result that I just showed you, I can basically say, well, what happens if I perturb my bump by some amount given by a function psi of x? Okay, and I want to look at whether that perturbation is going to grow. That would be, real part of lambda is positive, or shrinks. Real part of lambda is negative. It turns out if you plug this in and you expand to order epsilon and you truncate, then you get this spectral problem, this eigenvalue problem. And the spectrum of this linear operator gives you the local stability. Okay, so in this case, this part here, this minus psi, and this plus W convolved with F prime U psi is going to be our linear operator, okay? So at order 1, we just get our bump equation back, okay? And at order epsilon, we get, indeed, this linear operator that we've seen before. We saw it on Monday and Wednesday, okay? And notice, actually, always, if I take psi to be U prime and I plug it in, then I get the following formula, is that lambda U prime equals minus big U prime plus W convolved with F prime U prime. And if I differentiate my bump equation here, I actually get that U prime is equal to W convolved with F prime U prime, okay? So that tells me that the eigenvalue associated with the eigenfunction, big U prime, is 0. And that corresponds exactly to marginal stability, okay? So if I shift the bump by its own spatial derivative, basically I'm just moving that bump around. And by translation symmetry, indeed, I should expect it to be marginally stable to that kind of perturbation, okay? So to characterize the other perturbations, we can leverage the fact that we have a Heaviside nonlinearity. I can compute what F prime is just by differentiating F with U prime and sort of using the chain rule here. And it turns out that, when you differentiate a Heaviside, you get these delta distributions, and you have to scale them by U prime in order to properly account for this chain rule result, okay? And so at the end of the day, you get this as your eigenvalue equation. You actually localize your eigenvalue problem just to the edge of the bump. So what does this tells me? It tells me in the case of a Heaviside nonlinearity, all that matters is how I perturb the bump right on its edges. That's where all the action basically is, okay? And so in this case, this is my eigenvalue equation. I can solve it, right? I can basically formulate just a 2x2 eigenvalue problem now. And when psi of plus and minus a is equal to 0, then basically I have lambda equals -1. So any perturbations that don't touch my edges, the bump's going to be stable to those, okay? And otherwise, I have these odd perturbations, which are going to be like the shift perturbations that I already looked at. So I should get lambda equals 0 for those. And the even perturbations, okay? And the even perturbations are the interesting ones, basically. If I assume that psi a is equal to psi of minus a, then I get the following formula at x equals minus a, and another basically related formula at psi equals a. And I basically get that lambda plus 1 psi of minus a is equal to this expression here, okay? And so for my particular choice of bump and my weight function, I get this formula for my eigenvalue, which ends up being positive if a is less than pi over 4, and negative if a is greater than pi over 4. So what does that tell me? It tells me that for wide bumps, my bump is stable to these perturbations that change its width. And for narrow bumps, the bump is unstable to perturbations that change its width, okay? And an interesting observation is that really these narrow bumps, they behave like a separatrix of your full dynamical system, okay? So if you've done phase plane analysis before, maybe you've encountered phase plane systems essentially where you have a fixed point in one part of the phase plane and a fixed point in another that are stable. And in between, there's some sort of boundary that represents the basin of attraction of those two fixed points. The narrow bump really behaves like that analogously, but not quite, because it's an infinite dimensional system and there's all sorts of things that you can do. But basically, if you have an initial condition that's wide enough, it'll spread to the wide bump. If it's too narrow, it'll basically collapse to 0, okay? And your odd perturbations, as expected, give you a lambda equals 0, okay? You can extend this to the case of heterogeneous weights. I don't think I want to go through this because I don't want to have to rush through the stochastic analysis part, okay? But basically the idea here is that if we allow for inhomogeneities in the shape of our weight function, so basically there's some regions of the network that receive more excitation than others, then the bump will sort of have preferred locations in the network. So instead of living on a line attractor, it'll live on this sort of washboard type attractor, and it'll just sort of prefer to be at those locations. So I think that that breaks neutral stability to translations, and you no longer just have a 0 eigenvalue in that case. Okay. All right, so we've gotten to noise, and all we're going to do now is say, okay, well, let's say we have this bump solution, okay, to this part, this deterministic part. And if you haven't ever seen sort of a Langevin equation like this, basically we would just taken our PDE, and the deterministic part right now of the right-hand side is in here, and is multiplied by the differential dt. And now we're going to add in a noise term, okay? And the idea here is that, at each point in time, let's say in a simulation, we're going to add some normally distributed noise, but we're going to say that that noise has to have a particular spatial shape that's given by this function c, okay? And so indeed, this is, the movie that I showed you on the first slide. This is the result now of our bump. No longer does it just sit there indefinitely, okay? But it's going to wander around, and we want to calculate basically how much it wanders, kind of given by the location of that red line. And we can, and I'll show how we do that. But basically, the idea is, if we look at the variance of this location, this red bar here, as a function of time, as time evolves, basically that variance is going to scale linearly, which is indicative of a diffusion process. So I think we had a problem on a problem set on this in PDEs, if you took PDEs with me last semester, where basically we showed that, for something like a heat equation or a diffusion equation, the second moment of that process is going to, scale in time linearly with some coefficient that's basically given by your, heat conductivity or your diffusion coefficient, depending on your physical interpretation of your problem, okay? So that's the idea, is we want to say, well, this bump is really going to behave like a diffusing particle, like a dust particle getting, batted about by fluctuations. And how do we do that? That's finally, we're getting to some asymptotic analysis, okay? We're going to use an ansatz, okay? And this is a case where running that simulation first can help us kind of determine what kind of ansatz we might want to use. Also, our linear stability might have helped us with that, okay? But the idea is that we have a bump, and its location, we're going to assume, is going to be perturbed by the noise. And we're going to call that new location delta of t. And also the shape of the bump is going to change. But we're really not so interested in how the shape of the bump changes. We're really interested in how the position of the bump changes. And the solvability condition that we're going to get, or it's basically a boundedness condition, is going to allow us to determine an equation for delta, okay? So we plug this into this equation. We expand in powers of epsilon, okay? And we use, use something like the Fredholm alternative basically to enforce solvability. So the idea is that we want the inhomogeneity to be orthogonal to the null space of the adjoint of this linear operator, okay? And again, this is like what we did on Monday and Wednesday. Essentially, what this ensures is that there won't be any parts of this inhomogeneity that will lead to long-term instabilities in this solution, okay? It's almost like we're sort of preventing resonance in this differential equation here, okay? So what are the ingredients then that we need? We need the null space of the adjoint of this linear operator, okay? And we need to define an inner product, basically, that over which this inhomogeneity will ensure to be orthogonal with that, okay? And again, this is our linear operator from before, okay? So maybe no surprises there. And these terms have now been generated because of the additional dw term that we have here, and also the perturbation that we've made to our solution. Okay. So when we enforce that, okay, basically we say the integral of the null space of our adjoint of our linear operator against dw, okay, needs to be equal to minus epsilon times to the -1 times this part here, okay? When we apply that solvability condition and we basically isolate d alpha, we get this equation now for the delta term here, okay? Which looks a little bit like a mess, okay? But we have access to all of these functions. We just need to solve for the null space of this adjoint operator here, okay? And so what this is a stochastic differential equation, okay? So basically, if you average across realizations, what you find is that basically because W kind of has mean 0, the mean of delta is 0, okay? And the second moment, basically, if I take this and I multiply it by itself, okay, and then I integrate it across realizations, what I get is then an equation for the diffusion coefficient, okay? So this term in the denominator here, you see it's squared, right? This term here, you see it appears 2 times, okay, because this is a second moment. And then this correlation term here basically comes from averaging across realizations. And when I say realizations, I just mean, you know, if you ran this simulation 1,000,000 times, on average, what would this second moment be, okay? So this average across realizations goes back to, sorry, our statement of the form of this noise here, okay? That's that correlation function of the noise, okay? And basically, the smoother this function is, the smoother the noise is. If you make this a delta function, it'll be like the noise is sort of white in space, and every single spatial point has a different noise. If you make this a nice, wide, smooth function, then your noise perturbations are going to be really wide and smooth in space, okay? And so let's make things simple. Let's take C to just be pi times a cosine function. So that means basically you're going to have cosine shaped noise at every time point. So at each time point, you're going to get kicked by some, you know, sort of small bump shaped perturbation, but it's going to be chosen at a random point in your network, okay? W will still be that cosine function from before. So we can solve for U, we can differentiate U, and we get this pretty clean equation for the spatial gradient of U. This is our L here. So L star, if we do the integration by parts, is going to look like this. This is our adjoint operator now. And because this thing here is just like delta, the sum of 2 delta distributions, if you remember that before, our adjoint null space is just going to be the sum of a couple of delta distributions, okay? So we can work that out basically by self-consistency. This null space, right, is going to be equal to this delta function up here in front of this integral, okay? So we're going to evaluate x at minus a, because that's the only point where the delta function's non-zero. And we'll evaluate the integral here at x equals a, because that's the only point where this delta function is non-zero. And this tells us that basically phi of 0 needs to be you know, some constant times a delta function plus some other constant times a delta function centered here at minus a. And we can work it out. It turns out it's just delta of x plus a minus delta of x minus a, okay? So plug all that in, right? It simplifies these integrals greatly because we just have to evaluate them at x equals plus and minus a, y equals plus and minus a. We have our correlation function here. We have our spatial gradient. Plug it all in, and we actually get a fairly simple formula for this diffusion coefficient. The bigger the noise is, the bigger epsilon is, the more the bump diffuses, okay? The bigger the bump is, the less it diffuses, okay? So maybe that makes some kind of sense. If you have a big wide bump, okay, it's harder to perturb that bump with noise. If you have a smaller bump, it's easier to perturb that bump with noise, okay? And remember, this only works for the wide stable bumps. This won't work for the unstable bumps, because if you perturb them with noise, they'll just die out, okay? And indeed it works. So basically, as I change theta here, that is going to give me narrower bumps, and those bumps will diffuse more. As I increase the amplitude of noise, that'll make my bumps diffuse more. The blue lines here are this formula, and then the red dots are the results of running simulations of that neural field model a bunch, and then looking at the second moment of the positions of the bump, and we find that the simulation results lie nicely along our theory curve here, okay? All right, so we could ask how bumps are influenced by spatial heterogeneity, but maybe I'll pause for questions, see if there's any questions right now.
Quite a while back, you said something about the I think the perturbation being determined by the endpoints with the heavy stuff.
Yeah, that's yeah, here, right.
And then I think it was at the end of this slide.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So
yeah, it's all it's this part here, yeah.
Yeah, is somewhere hidden in here, I guess, is it that we've assumed that psi is analytic? Did we do an expansion in psi at some point?
Yeah, I think you have to assume sufficient smoothness of psi. So you're saying we can't assume psi is some weird non-analytic function where
I was just that like that it's determined by the value of the endpoints was kind of reminiscent of like error corrections in things, and I was just wondering if there was some connection there with
I mean, it's
analyticity.
more just because this function f prime here, right, is just the sum of two delta distributions. And so the only way basically to make lambda change, right, is to change this right-hand side, which only depends on psi evaluated at the endpoints because of the form of f prime here. So yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily the result of any analyticity assumption, more so just like the particular form of f, because if f is a smooth function, then actually it matters the values of psi at other places. It's just the peculiarity of this kind of non-generic choice of the nonlinearity that we've taken here.
Okay.
Yeah, it just makes your life a lot easier to take this step function, and you can do explicit things. So the first person to discover that was this person Amari in the 70s. He sort of developed this analysis. Okay, so anyway, so we've accounted for this wandering. We can estimate the changes of the diffusion coefficient with the parameters of our model, and that basically tells us as we change the threshold of our network. If we want less diffusion, we want a low threshold network, and we want to sort of limit this noise as much as possible. Okay, but another way that we might do that is say, well, maybe we can invoke some sort of changes in the synaptic coupling. So there's all sorts of plasticity mechanisms in the brain that allow the brain to change the arrangement and strength of networks, especially in cortex. The cortex is highly plastic, and that is what a lot of people think is responsible for the incredible learning abilities of mammals. Although we're a very mammal-centric species because we are mammals. So other non-mammalian species can learn too. So it's not all about cortex, but that's just what we study a lot. So so what we're going to do is we're going to say, well, what if there's certain locations in the network that have a little bit stronger coupling than others, and a little bit weaker, other areas have weaker coupling. So if I take the frequency of this heterogeneity here, that's multiplying my weight function now, if I take that to be 2, or if I take that to be 8, that's going to determine kind of this ring of saddles and node points, sort of preferred positions of my bumps. The blue points now are preferred locations, and the red circles are saddles. So the bump is always going to kind of relax back to these locations around the ring, and it's going to be repelled from the red circles. And the result that that has is, if there's no heterogeneity, here's a spatiotemporal plot of my bump. But if I introduce this heterogeneity, you see if I start out a bump here at 0, it gets pinned to this location, right? And even when n equals 8, you see it sort of prefers to dwell at these cyan lines. That's the locations of the attractors of this network. So this has a benefit, right? It stabilizes the bumps to noise perturbations, which helps you maintain memory better. But the bad part of it is that, well, now the network can basically only remember 8 possible locations. But maybe that's good enough, and maybe that's fine enough resolution for something you're interested in, right? If you want to roughly remember which direction is home, maybe you don't remember that it's precisely at 313.4 degrees. Maybe rounding off to the nearest 10 is good enough, and so you can set up that many discrete attractors in your network. Okay. So that's one way of improving bump, I guess, sort of bump stability. Another is to consider that there's actually a bunch of networks in the brain that encode bumps, and if you couple them together, then that will end up stabilizing bumps to noise perturbations over time. And so it's basically because any noise, let's say in one area, this is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, not so important what it's called, and this is the frontal eye fields. If both of those have a bump sort of storing memory, you can imagine, you could average the locations that you're getting from each of these networks, or if you sort of tether these bumps together, they will sort of prevent each other from sort of wandering away from each other. So that'll have the effect of sort of canceling out a little bit of this wandering, right? It's like if you have 2 wandering particles and you tie them together, okay, then they can't wander the opposite direction. They can only sort of wander the same direction. So that'll limit how much those will diffuse together, right? Or a matter, I don't know, tying a bunch of animals together, right? Like they're not going to go as far as sort of one animal that's not tied to anybody. Okay, so so the impact of this coupling, right? We can explore, and we can also look at delays. I'm not going to talk about that. We don't have a lot of time, so I won't really go through the analysis, but it's interesting if you have a background in stochastic processes. But the idea now is that bumps in each of these layers is going to be sort of tethered to one another, as I said, and that'll prevent them from sort of diffusing as far as they would if they weren't coupled otherwise. Okay, and so we'll just kind of jump to the end here. The idea is that if this kappa value is this coupling parameter, the stronger it is, the less the bump diffuses over time. So over time, this is basically your second moment of the bump, right? Instead of diffusing at this rate, you sort of diffuse sort of sublinearly over time, and this is due to this sort of coupling effect. Okay, but if there's correlations in the noise across the layers, then actually this result sort of cancels out because the bumps are getting the same form of noise. Okay, so I think that's kind of all I wanted to say today. I feel like maybe I have a conclusion slide, but no, that's pretty much all I have. So that, in summary, is stochastic perturbations to neural field models. The idea is that you can look at all these different sort of physiological features of neural networks and see using asymptotics and a little bit of stochastic processes knowledge, how these different features sort of limit or shape the diffusion properties of bumps in a large scale network. There's a lot of other applications of this in neural field theory, and of course, many other areas of math biology or mathematical physics, where you have these sort of nonlinear pattern forming systems. And these methods actually have been passed around between both reaction diffusion models, neural field type models, and other things like swarming models that other folks in the department like Nancy Rodriguez work on. All of these, as long as you have sort of these pattern solutions that have these translation symmetry properties, asymptotics are very useful for trying to study how different heterogeneities in models reshape those solutions. Okay. So I think that's all for me for the semester, for lectures. Looking forward to you all's project presentations next week. Any questions before we conclude for the day?
I have a question, but it's
Sure.
more about my project than.
Yeah, that's fine. We can
Yeah.
hold over till yeah, I guess after the folks leave. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, and